Let's talk about antitrust today, business law students. We all have this image of big corporations crushing competition and keeping prices high. That's the type of thing we're talking about today. And of course, it is your job to keep your companies out of trouble for not violating these antitrust laws. All right. Today, we're going to talk about what's known as the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Act. Let's first look at an antitrust overview. And let me share real quickly. Or maybe not that quickly. As quickly as I can get there.
What one a monopoly situation is
Thank you for your patience. Oh, let me make sure that I'm sharing the sound as well. Don't want to make that mistake. There we go. Didn't share the sound. Here we go.
what if one a monopoly situation exists with one company powerful enough to make it pretty much impossible for new players to appear. Two, Company A and Company B agree to divide the city in two, with each becoming a monopoly in one half and letting the quote-unquote competitor do the same in the other. Three, two companies with a 30% market share each would merge, with the resulting entity being large enough to drive everyone else out of business. 4. A handful of companies that used to outbid one another by offering lower and lower prices decide to collude instead and fix prices, keeping them at a level they're happy with. 5. Certain companies engage in bid rigging, allowing one another to win auctions by agreeing on who wins beforehand, and everyone else just pretending to be a legitimate bidder. In such situations and many more, consumers would stand to lose in light of the fact that competition would be abandoned, leading to monopoly situations, cartel scenarios, and so on. As such, in the US at least, so-called antitrust laws exist to protect them, with the famous or infamous top three being 1. The Sherman Antitrust Act, 2. The Federal Trade Commission Act, and 3. The Clayton Antitrust Act. These laws act as deterrents, with those who break them risking anything from financially debilitating fines to even jail time. Do all consumers love these laws? No. Ask a libertarian and he will tell you that government interference does more harm than good. Ask a Keynesian and he'll tell you it's a great idea. Ask a Marxist-Leninist and he will suggest far more aggressive state involvement, and so on. If you're searching for consensus, yeah, good luck with that.
All right. That's a good overview, basically, of telling you the types of actions by your companies that are prohibited. We're going to get a little more detail, but let's move on to another good little video that talks about the history of antitrust and how it uh, proceeded in the US and why there was this interest in creating these laws. What led to it historically?
18.
Bear with me while I share. Thank you.
And America was in uproar. The public had begun to grow hostile towards large corporations such as Standard Oil and the American Railway Union. The reason? These companies had begun to unfairly monopolize their industries, leading to what consumers felt was exorbitantly high prices on basic necessities. It didn't take long for this outcry to reach the ears of the country, the people who could do something about it, the government. The result of this would be something that would define the history of America's economics. Senator John Sherman of Ohio felt the need to do something about this for the people. Chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and Secretary of the Treasury under Hayes' presidency, he not only had the experience, but also the power to help his constituents, Americans. Soon, his work was done, and he had devised an answer to the problem of trusts. On April 8, 1890, the bill was brought before the Senate and passed with astounding success, with a vote of 51 for it and only 1 against it, reaching the requirement of unanimous consent. As if that wasn't unanimous enough, when it reached the House, it was passed with a vote of 242 votes for it and 0 against it, making it one of the least contested bills in the history of the United States. Finally, the Sherman Antitrust Act would make its way onto the President's desk, where it was signed on July 2nd, 1890, making its total journey time an astoundingly quick 85 days. The Sherman Antitrust Act prohibited anti-competitive agreements from being made, and unilateral conduct that would monopolize and or attempt to monopolize the relevant market. This would allow Congress to exercise all the power it possessed, to put it in the exact terms used. The penalty for violation of this act under federal jurisdiction was a fine of $5,000 and 1 year in jail. $5,000 in today's currency would be $160,000. Despite not seeming like a lot, the rest of the repercussions would hurt much more. The Sherman Antitrust Act would allow any company suffering losses to sue the offending companies for 3 times the losses that they believe they suffered, as well as the offenders facing the punishment from the government. But this victory over monopolies did not last long. Only 5 years after the passing of the act, in the United States versus E.C. Knight Company, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of E.C. Knight Company, dismantling the act in the process. Despite this, it would later be temporarily revived during the trust busting of President Theodore Roosevelt, during which the government would dissolve the Northern Securities Company in 1901. After this, President Taft would use the act against the Standard Oil Company and the American Tobacco Company. Although this would be the last usage of the act in its original sense, it would effectively be replaced by the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914 and laid to rest.
All right, now you've seen the things that are intended to be prohibited as antitrust activities and also the history why we passed that law. Let's jump. Bear with me. I want you to be able to read these things as I'm going over them. I'm sure you all know them. The more senses you use on studying, the more likely you are to recall and those later. So first, let's talk about the Sherman Antitrust Act. Basically, Section 1, collusions. 2, 1 or 2. And it basically just prohibits restraints of trade that have a significant impact on interstate commerce. So if you're colluding between 2 potential customers to try to get the price higher on the car you're selling personally, well, that's probably not a restraint of trade that will have a significant impact on interstate commerce. However, there are certain acts that will. Things that are considered just a per se or on its face a violation are anti-competitive acts by companies. They'll look at the agreements usually behind companies or when you're purchasing companies. So basically, there's 2 major restraints they're thinking of. One is horizontal restraints. So let's use agriculture. So well, no, let's do horizontal first, and then we'll go over to vertical. Yeah. So horizontal restraints. So let's say that we have an industry group or huge trade conferences once a year, and I see my actual buddies from the competing company. Well, if I get together with them and say, look, if we increase our prices by 20% and you increase your prices by 20 cents, we're both big companies, there's nothing the customers can do. They have to pay the extra 20%. Well, that is a price fixing agreement that is prohibited. Group boycotts. Boy, Walmart won't charge the extra 20%. So none of we suppliers are going to sell to Walmart. Well, that's a group boycott. Market divisions, hey, I'm only going to serve Oklahoma, you have California. That way we can both not have competition with each of those states and we will raise prices. And, I've seen instances that with different companies. Trade associations, well, we have trade associations, so you have to be real careful what you say. You don't exchange pricing information, et cetera, et cetera. Joint ventures, same thing. Now, what are vertical restraints? Well, sometimes, and let's jump back to this is where I wanted to get to agriculture. You are a bakery and you own hundreds of bakeries around the US or thousands, and you want to charge even more. So what you do is you actually buy the land upon which wheat is grown. You buy the transportation company that takes the wheat to the mill. You buy the mill that processes it. And then your transportation company brings it to your bread company, which distributes it. Well, you own the entirety of that, so you can charge whatever you want. Well, that's the model. It usually doesn't happen quite that egregiously. So the feds basically say you can't really have territorial or customer restrictions. There's a lot of exemptions and resale price maintenance agreements. So for a lot of years, when you'd go into a store, you'd say suggested retail price. Boom. Why was it suggested retail price? Because theoretically, the manufacturer could say, we want you to resell uh, Macy's. We want you to sell our clothes at this price. But theoretically, they could not require Macy's to sell at that price, or that might be a restriction, an antitrust restriction. Section 2 goes over to monopolies. Okay, there's a different type of thing where instead of you colluding with other companies or buying companies, you are so large in the market that you would have monopoly power. And um, it's not, you don't have monopoly power just because of superior product or business acumen. You do it because you bought up all the companies, you bought up all your competitors, and you have an intent to exclude any competition. And you're big enough that you have a dangerous probability of success. So this is monopoly. I'd like you either pause now or at the end of this lecture, watch this. Uh, uh, um, and if this isn't on the original lecture outline, I will add this to the lecture outline after I do this video. So by the time you see it, this will have changed. So copy and paste this into YouTube. It's a really good overview of Section 2 and monopolization. I want to say it's 10 minutes. What's a basically monopolization violation? Things like price discrimination in interstate commerce with goods that are similar grade and quality. Obviously, I could sell lesser grade technology for a lower price and higher technology for a higher price. That's not a violation. And goods sold to two or more purchasers, I might be distinguishing between them. Or some of the defenses, if you're accused of this monopolization or Clayton Act Section 2 violations, well, number one, you could say, look, we sell our bread lower in Kansas at a lower price because we don't have to transport it all the way to California. So that's a cost justification. It's not an antitrust violation. It makes sense why it would be two different prices for the same product. You might meet a competitor's price in certain markets. You might say, I'm going to sell my more likely gas because that's so competitive at a lower price because look across the street, this guy's selling lower. Well, you're not going to be tested on this, but just FYI, there's another consideration, which is you can't really sell products below cost because that's also can be considered a competitive problem where you're trying to drive out by you're big enough and you sell so many groceries that you can afford to sell gas at below prices, and that way you'll run out all your competition. And then as soon as all the competitive gas stations close down, you raise your gas far above. Changing market conditions, etc. Um, Let me just note a couple of these. We've already talked about mergers where you can do horizontal merger on the right side here, section 7, where you're buying out your competitors. Sometimes you'll see in the newspaper where the feds are looking at a merger of two major companies, phone company, telecommunications, something, and they might block it because they say you will have too much power for this television stations. That's a horizontal merger. Vertical merger we talked about in the bread distribution, where you buy from top to bottom in the distribution chain. Section 3, you have to be careful what your distribution agreements say. Can they only deal with you, no one else? Tying arrangements, etc. These are some things that you have to be really careful of in your distribution chain. Now, once federal agencies find that there's a violation, well, what happens? So if you're a private party, you or your company, and you think you've been injured by some anti-competitive activity, antitrust activity by another company, you could actually sue for damages and you can get 3 times your damages plus attorney's fees if you win. That's the agency action and also private actions. Well, that was private action, but the agency, the federal agency in charge, also can go after companies for anti-competitive, antitrust activities. All right, same thing. Treble damages and attorney's fees. Now, there are some particular types of arrangements or entities, organizations that are exempt from these, believe it or not. Unions, which I find a little surprising when I learned this many years ago, because theoretically they can drive labor costs up, which in turn um, drive costs up to the end consumer. And on the other side, it's a good protection for employees that historically might have been not treated well by huge companies. So there's a balancing act there. But the practical effect is Detroit used to be huge auto manufacturing, but the production costs and particular labor costs got so high over time that now you see that in certain respects, the automobile manufacturing industry in the Detroit area is a ghost town. And a lot of that production has gone offshore. It's very common for American sold automobiles to come from Japan, Germany, Canadian manufacturer, Mexican final manufacturer, etc. And so it's a real balancing act, and you could see this change over time. But the point is, unions are exempt because of political power right now from antitrust actions. Agriculture cooperatives, what that is like a lot of grain farmers will sell to the same mill and it'll be such and such co-op. Same thing with dairy farmers. They'll sell all their milk to the same co-op and they're exempt from being prosecuted for these antitrust activities. Insurance companies, I think we all know that based on the insurance we pay on our homes and on our cars, and professional baseball, believe it or not. Uh, Here's a good, I got this from a corporation on their antitrust policies, and this is some really good things. Remember this so you stay out of trouble um, as you go into your careers. Oops, here we go. When you're with competitors, don't talk about your prices, their prices, how you price, terms and conditions, sale, etc. Just don't. Even if it's in good faith, you're having dinner, it can be problematic. Okay, don't do it. Um, Pricing strategies, advertising for prices. Don't do cooperative advertising with competitors. Rational pricing. I mean, you see this whole list of things that, and again, you might run into your competitor, somebody you might have gone to school with. You might see them at trade fairs. They're not enemies, but you just have to be real careful about the types of things you talk about because pushed too far, these could be considered antitrust violations. Now, final thing, there are similar laws throughout Asia, Asia Pacific, South America, Central America, and especially the EU. Um, the EU will call them competition laws. So, but there's a lot of similarities in that we see as we see in the US. So, believe it or not, I know you were just dying to spend more time on school, but that's it this week, and I thank you for your attention.